in the minyan ha-mitzvahs, in the count of mitzvahs in the very beginning of the Rambam in the Sefer Hayad, so too in his Sefer HaMitzvahs, the Rambam writes as the very last of the mitzvahs aseh, the Rambam says the mitzvah is lodun b'dinei nachlois, to rule, to judge in regards to the dinim of inheritance, as the pasuk says. This is a pasuk in this week's parsha. Ish ki yamus uvein ein lo, if a person passes away and he doesn't have a son. Now it's known that the order of the Rambam is very, very precise. So based on this, we can understand that the fact that the Rambam particularly finishes off the mitzvah aseh with the mitzvah of nachlois is because this mitzvah, in a certain sense, is like the culmination, the completion of all the mitzvahs, of the ideas of all the mitzvahs. Just like we know that the first mitzvah that the Rambam counts, leida sheyeshem elekat, to know that there is Hashem, as the pasuk says, Anoichi Hashem elekecha. The reason why this is counted as the first mitzvah is understood simply because this is the first and the most essential of the mitzvahs that come following it. As the Rambam says in Sefer Hayad, that Yesod is the foundation of all foundations, the pillar of all wisdoms, is to know that Hashem exists. As the Rambam himself is medayik, is particular in the counting of the mitzvahs. He says mitzvah rishona, the very first mitzvah, is this mitzvah. So from this we can also understand in regards to the last mitzvah that he counts as the dinim of nachalois, the dinim of inheritance, that clearly it's coming specifically as the last mitzvah of the mitzvah saseh, because in a certain sense this is like the culmination, the completion of all the mitzvahs. So this is what the Rebbe wants to discuss in our Sicha, what's unique about this particular mitzvah. Now, ba'ashkafa rishona, at first glance, we'd be able to say simple reason is because since all the mitzvahs of the Torah are performed in the duration of the life of the person while the person is alive, whereas the mitzvah of inheritance is connected to the time of afterlife, this is why the Rambam puts this as the end of all the mitzvahs. But the Rebbe says it's understood that it's a very, very great doichek. It's very difficult to explain it this way because there's quite a few mitzvahs that the Rambam enumerates much earlier which are also connected either with the death of a person or things that happen after death. In addition to this, says the Rebbe, the dinim of nachlois, of inheritance, is not a mitzvah that's on the person himself or something like that. It's a mitzvah on based in that they have to rule in things that are related in the dinim of nachlois, of inheritance. As the Rambam himself explains in detail, the whole order of the nachlois, of inheritance, in the halachos in Sefer Hayad itself. In other words, Beis Din has to judge, Beis Din has to rule what should be the order of how inheritance has to be taking place for the people that are alive. For those Yershim, for those that inherit, that are alive, it's not about the person who passed away. And therefore, says the Rebbe, there's no room for this idea to connect the order of this mitzvah, to put it last, just because it comes after the person passed away. Another thing, says the Rebbe, we need to understand. In regards to this mitzvah of lodun dinei machlois, the Rambam brings a pasuk. We quoted this before. This is the pasuk from our parsha. Shenemar, the pasuk says, "Ish ki yamos," if a person passes away, uvein ein lo, and doesn't have a son. Seemingly, says the Rebbe, in these words, there is nothing about the mitzvah itself, about the content of the mitzvah itself. Now, there are versions in the Rambam where the Rambam actually does quote more words of the pasuk. Va'avartem es nachalosoi, that then the inheritance will move on instead of going to the sons, who will move on to. According to some versions, it also finishes off with the words v'hoisa, and all these dinim will be l'chukas mishpat, as a law, as a judgment, etc. Those words are more connected to the mitzvah of nachlois, of the mitzvah of inheritance. But, says the Rebbe, since in the common prince of the Rambam, the words are only ish ki yomus uvein ein lo, he says the Rebbe, we have to say that somehow in these words itself is expressed the whole content of the mitzvah of lodun b'dinei nachlois, the dinim of inheritance. Says the Rebbe, simply we could say that by bringing the first words of this section of this parsha, the Rambam actually means everything that follows, as we find this in other mitzvahs by the Rambam himself. But, says the Rebbe, since again we know that everything in Torah is very, very meduyik, everything is precise, says the Rebbe, it makes sense to say especially since the Rambam doesn't even put in the word v'goymer to be hinting to the rest of the parsha, it makes sense to say that in these words itself, there's something very essential and crucial about the whole idea of nachlois that are specifically expressed in these words. Says the Rebbe, we can explain it in the following way. The fact that the Rambam concludes the minyan ha-mitzvahs with dinei nachlois is similar to what we find in the end of Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, that it finishes off with the words Asid HaKadosh Baruch Hu Lahanchil Chol Tzadik v'Tzadik Chulu. In the future, Hashem is going to give as an inheritance to each and every tzaddik. It speaks about all these worlds that Hashem is going to give to every tzaddik. Shenemar, the pasuk says, Lahanchil Oy Hava Yesh. The Eibishter is going to give as an inheritance to those that love him, Yesh, which we'll see later a little bit more in the Sicha what the word Yesh means, but the Gemara understands it as a reference to Yesh's Shin Yud, 310 Oilamis, etc. The Mefarshim explain that the reason why Mishnayos finishes off with this particular statement is because this statement is speaking about the reward for Torah and mitzvahs, the reward that comes after a person has completed doing his Torah and mitzvahs. So this is what the pasuk is speaking about, that Asad HaKadosh Baruch Hu Lahanchil, the Eibishter in the future will give this reward, but it's specifically these words Lahanchil, because the reward that comes after Torah and mitzvahs is this idea of lahanchil, of giving as an inheritance. As again, we'll soon see more what this is all about. And the Rebbe says in a similar way is by the Rambam. The Rambam also finishes off with the idea of nachalois, because the ending and the culmination, the completion of all mitzvahs of the Torah are all connected with this idea of a nachala, of an inheritance. How do we understand this? Says the Rebbe, we're going to understand this by first prefacing that this parsha, this section that discusses inheritance in the Torah, is coming in continuation and following on from the discussion in our parsha about the inheritance and the division of Eretz Yisrael. It's in connection to this that the daughters of Tzlafchad argued that they want an inheritance together with their father's brothers. And that's when the Torah says, Ish kiyamos, if a person passes away without sons, what should then happen to his his properties, etc. Says the Rebbe, we find in regards to this idea of the division of the land of Eretz Yisrael, that in addition to the general idea that yes, the Yidden took over Eretz Yisrael, Yerusha Saras, they took it as an inheritance, but more specifically we find three ideas. There is what's called Yerusha Saras, that they took it as an inheritance. There's also the idea that's expressed in the Torah that says, L'rav tarba nachalosid, you'll give a bigger shevet, a bigger portion, a smaller shevet, a smaller portion. And there's also what the Torah says, Ach begoyrel yichalek asaris, that is going to be divided through a lottery, through a goyrel. In other words, in the connection of Eretz Yisrael to the Yidden, specifically, there are three different levels or three different ideas, which we're going to discuss. And they are, number one, again, Yerusha as an inheritance. There is a division that comes based on logic, a calculation. You give a bigger shevet more, etc. And then there is the idea of a goyrel, of a lottery. Says the Rebbe, the reason why there are these three divisions of Eretz Yisrael is because the fact that the Yidden get Eretz Yisrael as their inheritance is not just a way of giving over the land and dividing it to the Yidden. There's something deeper going on over here. The Rebbe says Eretz Yisrael, we know, is called the Nachalas Hashem. It's Hashem's inheritance, Hashem's portion. We know the pasuk says, Tamidei Hashem Elokecha, Hashem's eyes are always upon the land from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. And that's why it was given to Yidden specifically, who are also called Nachalas Hashem, Hashem's inheritance. They are specifically connected with Hashem. The Chazal say, the Medrash says, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem said, let the Yidden come, the Yidden who are my portion, and let them get Eretz Yisrael, that's my portion. And therefore, says the Rebbe, the giving of Eretz Yisrael, which is called the Nachlas Hashem, to the Yidden, is really revealing it as an expression of the Yidden's connection to Hashem. Therefore, says the Rebbe, just like we find that in the connection of the Yidden with Hashem, there's three ways. We say every morning in our davening, Ashreinu matov chalkeinu, how fortunate we are, matov chalkeinu, how good is our portion. Umanoim goyraleinu, how sweet is our lot. Umayafa Yerushaseinu, how beautiful is our inheritance. So we have three things over there, chalkeinu, goyraleinu, and Yerushaseinu. Similarly, in the giving of Eretz Yisrael to the Yidden, there's also these three ideas. There's Chelek, there's Goyrol, and there's Yerusha. Says the Rebbe, since in the order of the three things, Chelek, Goyrol, and Yerusha, the last one of them is Mayafa Yerushaseinu. We said Hasheinu Matev Chelkeinu, Manoim Goyrolenu, Mayafa Yerushaseinu. And it's clearly saying greater and greater things. So Mayafa Yerushaseinu is the greatest thing. The Rebbe says, obviously, this is telling us that Yerusha has in it a certain advantage, a certain depth, much more than the other two. Says the Rebbe, we need to understand, number one, what is really the difference between Chelek and Goyrol and Yerusha as these different ways in the bond between the Yidden and Hashem. What does each one of them represent? And number two, we need to understand, how do we b'chlal understand this concept of Yerusha, of inheritance? And inheritance usually happens when a person passes away, to use the expression back in the pasuk that we said before, Ish Kiyamus. How do we understand this idea of inheritance when we're speaking about a connection between Yidden and Hashem? Says the Rebbe, we can explain it. The difference between Chelkeinu and Goyrolenu, we can explain it similar to the difference between a sale and a matana and a gift, a present. So there is first starting with these two, and later we're going to get to Yerusha. The idea of a sale is always dependent on the money, the payment of the buyer. In other words, he's paying for the item that he's buying. That's what a sale is. Matana, on the other hand, is coming from the goodwill of the giver of the present. In other words, it's not about a payment. It's not coming something from the makabel, from the recipient. It's only about the one who's giving the present. Similarly, says the Rebbe, in the hamshachas, the hashpois, all the things that Hashem is giving to the Yidden, there are also two general ways. There is what we call the reward for mitzvahs, the payment for mitzvahs. This is the kind of hamshacha which is coming down through the avodah of the person, which we call isarusa de l'sato, that everything that's coming from above is coming as a result of the person's avodah, which is obviously going to be more similar to the idea of a sale. And then there's what comes from the Eibishter's own graciousness, kindness, isarusa de l'ela on its own, just coming from Hashem himself. Says the Rebbe, this is also the general difference between Chelkeinu and Goyrolenu. Chelkeinu is that bond that a Yid has with Hashem that happens as a result of the avodah of the Yid, similar to a sale. On the other hand, Goyrolenu, a lottery, when we say Manoim Goyrolenu, how sweet is our lot, this is the bond of with the Yid and with the Eibishter coming because of the Eibishter. That Hashem chose us. Real free choice is the idea that the thing that's being chosen is not coming because of a certain calculation, because of a certain reason, because of certain logic, because of the quality of the thing being chosen or the like, but rather just because this is the desire, this is the will of the one who is choosing. It's coming from the one who's choosing. And in this aspect, this is similar to the idea of when you choose something through a goyrel, through a lottery, which is coming not based on a certain logical idea connected with a certain quality on which you're making the goyrel or the like. Rather, you're completely relying on the goyrel, not knowing exactly who's going to win the lottery, what the lottery is going to fall on. To use the words of the pasuk, it says, "B'cheik yutal es hagoyrel." The goyrel is placed in the lap. In other words, we make a goyrel. Ume Hashem kol mishpatoi, but Hashem is the one that makes the decisions. Hashem is the one that decides what's going to happen. So this idea of this goyrel is more, or this bechira that Hashem chooses us, this is more similar to the idea of matana, like a gift that's completely dependent only on the desire, on the will of the one who is giving. The only difference, says the Rebbe, is that by a matana, by a sale, in a certain sense, it's still, by a matana, by a gift, by a present, in a certain sense, it's still similar to sale in the sense, because yes, even though it's true it's coming because of the giver, but nevertheless, there's always going to be a reason why you're giving the gift. As Chazal say, if you wouldn't have done something nice, making the person happy in some way, he wouldn't have given you a present. Whereas a goyrel is completely higher than reason. But generally speaking, in this sense, matana is similar to the idea of goyrel, that is both really based on mainly the one who is giving the present, not so much the recipient, and so to goyrel, it's goyrel or bechira, which is coming because that's what Hashem wants. It's not coming because of the Yid. The Rebbe takes it a step deeper. Till now we said Chelkeinu is when the Yid is doing avodah. It's coming because of his quality. And Goyrel is coming just because of Hashem. Now the Rebbe says, in truth, Chelkeinu is connected not only to the Avodah of a Yid. Chelkeinu is also connected to the very actual existence of the Yid, the Etzem Metzius of the Yid. Because the Neshama of a Yid is called Chelek Hashem Amoy. He's a part of Hashem. Or as in the expression of Tanya, the Nefesh Hashem is b'Yisrael Chelek Elikami Ma'amamish. So even the essence of the Yid is called Chelek. But nevertheless, there's still an advantage in the idea of Goyrel, even if you look at Chelek in this way. And the Rebbe explains, the fact that we say about the Neshama of a Yid that's a Chelek Elikami Ma'amamish is expressing the quality, the Kedusha, again, in the Metzius of the Yid, in his existence, in his essence, who he is. And the Rebbe says, we could say that this is why the Alter Rebbe connects this idea of Chelek Elikami Ma'amamish with the idea that Yidden are called children to Hashem, Bonim Lamokim, Bonim Atem LaHashem Lekechem, just like by a child in the literal sense, which is connection to his father, is something that's related to the Metzius of the child. In other words, it's still very much about the child. So therefore, says the Rebbe, even Chelkeinu in this sense is still in some way similar to the idea of a mecher, of a sale, meaning it's still somehow related to the one who is the consumer, who is the buyer. In our case, the Maila of the Yid himself. Whereas Goyreleinu, again speaking about the lottery, which we said is something completely higher than Seichel, more like the idea of Bochar Bona, that Hashem just chooses us because of him. So that's not coming because of the special milas, because of the special qualities, or the mitzias, or the actual mitzias of the Yid, which no matter how great it is, it's still in some way limited. It's a finite quality or finite kedusha, because it's still connected somehow with the mitzias, with the existence, with his own being. But rather, the idea of Bechira, the idea of Goyrel, this is a bond that's coming completely on Hashem's terms, from Hashem. It's from Hashem himself, that's completely higher than any limitations. The Rebbe says, based on this, we could also explain a pasuk, the double expression in a pasuk. The pasuk says, Ki kodesh ato la Hashem elikecha, you're holy to Hashem, uvecha bachar Hashem, and Hashem chose you. Rashi explains, Ki am kodesh ato, because you're a holy nation. Rashi says, Kedushas atzmucha me'avisecha, that's your own kedusha that you have from the avos. And then there's an additional thing that Hashem chose you. Which means as follows. Am Kodesh Ata, that's the idea that a Yid is holy because Bonim Atem LaHashem Lekechem, as we said, they're children of Hashem. That's Kedushas Atzmucha, that's still related to their own mitzias. They are a holy object, they are a holy mitzias, a holy entity. But then there's something deeper and greater than that. And another thing, says Rashi, Bachar Hashem, there's also the idea that it's coming from the Bechira, from the free choice of Atzmos, which means this is beyond the limitation and the definition of the Yid on his own. So these were all a gift, a present, or a sale, or Chelkeinu and Goyreleinu. Says the Rebbe, now we're going to move to the next step. Nevertheless, says the Rebbe, even a matana that's coming completely from the giver, nevertheless, it's still a bond with the makabel, with the recipient. In other words, there's still two separate things. There's the giver and the receiver. The whole idea of a matana is that he's giving something that he had to someone else, to the recipient. And obviously, he has this special nachas from the other person. That's why he's giving him a present. He's focused on him, etc. Applying this first, before moving on to the idea of Yerusha, applying this, that we compare this to the idea of a goyrel. So the Rebbe says in a similar way, to some extent, is by Goyrel as well. Even though we said, yes, it's true, a Goyrel is not connected to the quality of the thing that you're going to get, as we said. Nevertheless, there's still some sort of idea that you're trying to give. You're trying to get a number of between a few things. You're trying to divide something. In other words, yes, to a certain extent that you're trying to get one of a few things, and you're going to decide it through a goyrel. But there's still something about that other thing that you're trying to connect with. But now, says the Rebbe, there's a third level. And that is the level of Yerusha. What's the definition of Yerusha? It's not about giving it to someone else. Rather, the Yoirish, the person who's inheriting, is standing in the place of the Moirish, of the one who's leaving the inheritance. This Yoirish, the one inheriting, is not like a second Metzias, a separate entity, which is receiving possessions from the Moirish, from the one who's leaving the inheritance. But to use the words of the Pasuk, Tachas avoisecha yiyu banecha, the children are standing in the place of the parents. The Yoirish, the one inheriting, is standing in the place of the one leaving the inheritance. It's like saying he's the very essence of the Moirish. And therefore, because he's an extension of that original person, then automatically the ownership also goes onto the items that this person is leaving. So in other words, the advantage of Yerusha, of inheritance over a sale or a gift, is that by a sale and a gift, and we also said matan is similar to the idea of a goydel, in all of these cases you're giving something, you're mashpia something. It's not that the person is just for himself, it's all about he's only giving when there is someone outside of himself. The only difference is, in Mecher Matana, as we said, is the reason why you're giving. We said in a sale, it's about the person who's receiving it, the money that he's giving, that's the cause of why you're giving. By Matana, it's coming, by a gift, it's coming more because of the goodwill of the giver. But still, even over here, it's all about you're trying to give something to someone else. So there's still two separate entities. Whereas by Yerusha, it's not a hashpah, it's not about giving to somebody else outside of yourself. It's rather the Yoirish, again, the person inheriting, is receiving the possessions because he's now standing in place of, he's an extension of the Moirish, the one who is leaving the inheritance. So applying this back, etc. So the advantage of Yerushaseinu compared to Chelkeinu and Geiraleinu. Chelkeinu, our portion, this is the connection of a Yid and Hashem. How Hashem, so to speak, was Metzamtzam, is contracting himself already to the avodah, to the work, to the qualities of the Yidden, that it should already matter to him. It should take some place, it should take up some space. Furthermore, we said before that this is also the level related to Bonim, where Yid is a child of Hashem. So we know, compared to Hashem himself, the Pasuk says, Gam ben va'achei lo, Hashem doesn't have a son, doesn't have a brother. The fact that Yidden are called Bonim is because Hashem was a mitzamtzim himself. Hashem contracted himself already into this title of being called a father. So this is level number one. In other words, where the mitzias of the Yid very much takes up a lot of space and his avodah takes up space. Goyrolenu, which is the level of the lottery higher than Seichel, which we said is Bochar Bonu, where Hashem is just choosing, coming from the level of Elikus, which is higher than the world taking up any space. So this is the level of Elikus, where both in Elikus and the Yid, where Metzias, the existence doesn't take up any space. It's coming, as we said, this is coming more because of the bond of the Eibishter. The Eibishter's free choice in the Yid, and it's not about the Yid's avodah. But nevertheless, even Bochar Banu is about that Hashem is choosing something that's Kavayochel, not himself. Because the whole idea of choosing is in relation to something or someone else. It's only, we said, the reason for the choice is not coming because of the Maila, because of the quality of the other thing, but it's rather the choice of the one choosing. But what's Yerushaseinu? As we said, Yerushaseinu is the idea that there is nothing outside of the Moirish. Yerushaseinu is about the fact that the Yidden are Kavayachal one with the very essence of Hashem. Yisrael, Yisrael and Hashem are one. This is the bond of the Yidden and the Eibishter in his very, very essence, which is higher than any sort of movement, a tzimtzum, or anything like that. And that's why it's called Yerusha, because that's the whole idea of Yerusha, as we explained, that the Yoirish, the one inheriting, is standing in the place of the Moirish. He's an extension, he's a continuation of the Moirish, because he's the very essence of the Moirish. Says the Rebbe, these three ideas of this iskashrus between Yidden and Hashem, Chelkeinu, Goyraleinu, and Yerushaseinu, could also be connected and generally related to the three general periods of Am Yisrael. We have the period before Matan Torah. We have the period once we got to Torah, the time when Yidden are doing their avodah of Torah and mitzvahs. And finally, we have the time of La'asid Lavi, the time of the reward, the payment, the tachlis, and the tachlis shleimus, the ultimate reward for the Yid's avodah. And the Rebbe explains, even before Matan Torah, the Yidden are already called Bonim, they're already called children. As it says by Yitzias Mitzrayim, it says, Bon Ebni B'chayre Yisrael, Hashem is referring to the Yidden as my firstborn son Yisrael. So even before Matan Torah, we already see in an open way the special quality of Yidden compared to the Umay Sa'ilam, which brought to Yitzias Mitzrayim. But that's still all very much dealing with the mile of their Mitzias, of their avoid, of their existence. In other words, the quality of themselves. By Matan Torah comes stage number 2, where it's revealed, Uvonu v'charta mikol am v'lashon, that Hashem chooses us. The Bechira of Hashem in Am Yisrael, as we said. And this is why it's expressed in the giving of Torah and mitzvahs to Yidden. And that's the whole chiddush of Torah and mitzvahs that were given by Matan Torah compared to the avodah of Yidden, the Avos, before Matan Torah. Because before Matan Torah, the avodah of the Yidden was very much measured and limited according to the koyach of the creature, of the created being, how much a person could reach with his own koyches. The whole chiddush of Matan Torah is that Hashem gave us His Torah. Hashem chose us. That means in the Torah and mitzvahs, there's now the power of the boirei, of the Creator. But then comes stage number 3, after the completion of fulfilling Torah and mitzvahs. By Yidden is Nizgala, the Atzmi is Dikamayla, their special quality that's on the deepest level of their essence, that Mayafoy Rishasenu, this idea of a nachla, of an inheritance, that Yidden are Kavayachol, mamish one with the essence of Hashem. Says the Rebbe, we now go back to the end of Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, where the Mishnah says, Asid HaKadosh Baruch Hu Lahanchel, Hashem is going to give us an inheritance, and brings the pasuk Lahanchel Oyavai Yesh. What does this word Yesh mean? The Rambam explains that the word Yesh represents on a mitzias, on an existence, on an entity that is constant and has absolutely no end and no limit. That's, in other words, referring to Atzmus Yizbarach, to the very essence, who's called the Yesh Amiti, the true and only existence. So what is Lahanchil Oyavei Yesh? That the Yidden are becoming Kavayachal mamish one with the Yesh Amiti. And that's why the expression is Lahanchil Oyavei Yesh, this idea of an inheritance. Because this oneness of a Yid with the Yesh Amiti, the absolute Yesh, is because of this idea of Nachla, because of this idea of an inheritance, that Yidden are Kavayachal, just the very essence of the Moirish, of the one who's giving the inheritance. Yidden are one with Hashem. Says the Rebbe, now we go back and understand also why the Rambam brings the mitzvah of Nachlois. He brings specifically the words of Ishkiyamus Uvein Einloi, about a person not having a son. What does this mean? Because the spiritual idea of Nachla, of inheritance, is specifically expressed in these words, Uvein Einloi, that he doesn't have a son. Because the special qualities of Chelkeinu and Geirolenu are connected with that aspect, that level within Hashem, how Hashem is already lowering himself down into the level of being a father, which already allows room for some other existence. A child, and in other words, this other existence is already a separate Metzias outside of Hashem. And that's why there is another existence, because Hashem is lowering himself down already to this level. Even based on the level of Geirolenu, which is the lottery, so to speak, that Hashem chose the Yidden. But nevertheless, and this is already higher than Metzias, but nevertheless, again, we said the fact that you're choosing something is, again, showing that there's something there that he's choosing them, that they should be children. However, the gather of Yerushaseinu is connected with the very, very essence of Hashem, where we said, where we use the expression, Uvein Einloi, that he doesn't have a son. In other words, he's higher than anything that's outside of him, even on the level of choosing it. And that's where Yidden are rooted. Yisrael, v'kudsha brichu, kul achad, Yidden and Hashem are completely, absolutely all one.